A small regional airport on a crisp autumn morning, where the sound of propeller engines fills the air and the smell of aviation fuel mingles with coffee from the pilot's lounge. Among the crowd of aviators preparing for what would become one of the most talked about flying competitions in decades, stands a figure that immediately draws whispers and sideways glances. She's 73 years old, with silver hair neatly pinned back, wearing a vintage leather jacket that's seen more sky than most pilots will in their entire careers. Her name is Margaret Maggie Harrison, and she's about to prove that age is nothing but a number when you've got the heart of a true aviator. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other at Riverside Municipal Airport, but there was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds. The annual Precision Flying Championship was about to begin, and pilots from across 3 states had gathered to compete in what many considered the ultimate test of flying skill. This wasn't just about speed or flashy aerobatics. This competition demanded the kind of precision that separated weekend warriors from true masters of the sky. Maggie had arrived early, as was her habit. She'd been flying for over 50 years, accumulating more than 20,000 hours of flight time. But to the younger pilots milling around the hangar, she was just another relic from aviation's past. They saw her carefully inspecting her aircraft, a meticulously maintained 1978 Cessna 182 that she'd owned for 3 decades and couldn't help but exchange knowing looks and barely concealed smirks. "Look at Grandma over there," whispered Jake Morrison, a hotshot pilot in his late 20s who flew for a regional airline. "Someone should tell her the museum's across town." His comment drew chuckles from the group of pilots surrounding him, all confident in their modern training and contemporary aircraft equipped with the latest avionics. Sarah Chun, a flight instructor, barely past 30, adjusted her designer aviator sunglasses and shook her head. "I admire her spirit, but honestly, this competition is going to be physically demanding. The precision maneuvers require split-second timing and lightning-fast reflexes. Maybe she should consider the spectator area instead." But Maggie had heard variations of these comments her entire flying career. When she'd first started flying in 1971, she was told aviation was a man's world. When she'd pursued her commercial license, they said she'd never make it in professional aviation. When she'd started competing in aerobatic competitions in her 40s, they said she was too old to be throwing an airplane around the sky. Now at 73, they were saying she was too old to compete at all. What they didn't know was Maggie's story, a story that began during the golden age of aviation when she was just a young woman with stars in her eyes and dreams that seemed impossible. Growing up in rural Montana, she'd spent countless hours watching crop dusters work the fields around her family's farm, mesmerized by the graceful way they danced between the earth and sky. Her father, a World War II veteran who'd flown B-17 bombers over Europe, had initially discouraged her aviation dreams, not out of malice, but out of concern for the challenges she'd face as a woman in a predominantly male field. Maggie was nothing if not determined. She'd saved every penny from her job at the local diner, taking on extra shifts and skipping social events until she had enough money for her first flying lesson. That first flight, in a battered old Piper Cub with an instructor who was initially skeptical but quickly became her biggest supporter, had changed everything. The moment the wheels left the ground, Maggie knew she'd found her calling. The path hadn't been easy. She'd faced discrimination, doubt, and countless obstacles that would have deterred someone with less determination. But with each challenge, she'd grown stronger, more skilled, and more passionate about aviation. She'd earned every rating and certificate she could, from private pilot to commercial, from instrument to flight instructor. building a reputation as one of the most skilled and safety-conscious pilots in the region. Now, as she completed her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had kept her accident-free for 5 decades, Maggie reflected on all the doubters she'd encountered over the years. Each one had underestimated her, and each one had eventually learned that wisdom, experience, and an unwavering commitment to excellence could triumph over youth and arrogance. The competition would consist of 3 main events: precision landing, where pilots had to touch down within a marked box on the runway; navigation accuracy, requiring pilots to follow a complex course while maintaining precise timing and altitude; and the aerial skills challenge, a series of maneuvers that tested everything from stall recovery to emergency procedures. It was designed to push pilots to their limits and separate the skilled from the merely confident. As the morning progressed and the official briefing began, Maggie took her place among the 47 other competitors. She listened intently as the judges explained the rules, the scoring system, and the safety protocols. Around her, younger pilots whispered about their strategies, their advanced equipment, and their certainty that this would be their year to shine. But Maggie remained focused, her mind already running through the challenges ahead. She'd studied the course meticulously, practiced the required maneuvers until they were second nature, and prepared both mentally and physically for what she knew would be the flight of her life. Little did the other competitors know that they were about to witness something extraordinary, a masterclass in aviation, skill that would challenge everything they thought they knew about flying and age. The registration table buzzed with activity as pilots signed waivers, collected their competition packets, and engaged in the traditional pre-competition banter that ranged from friendly trash talk to genuine technical discussions about aircraft performance and weather conditions. When Maggie approached the table, the volunteer coordinator, a middle-aged man named Bob Stevens who'd been organizing flying competitions for 15 years, did a double take. "Ma'am, I think you might be looking for the spectator registration," Bob said with what he intended as a helpful smile. "The pilot registration is pretty intense, and we've got some insurance requirements that might be—" "I'm Margaret Harrison," Maggie interrupted politely but firmly, sliding her logbook across the table. "I believe you'll find my registration in order, along with my current medical certificate, insurance documentation, and aircraft registration." Bob's expression shifted as he opened the logbook and began scanning the entries. Page after page revealed a flying career that spanned decades, with entries from airports across the country and beyond. Flight time in everything from basic trainers to complex turbine aircraft, aerobatic endorsements, instrument ratings, and commercial privileges. The numbers were staggering: over 20,000 hours of flight time, more than most airline pilots accumulate in their entire careers. "I apologize, Mrs. Harrison," Bob stammered, his cheeks reddening. "I didn't realize this is an incredible logbook. You've got more time than half our judges combined." The exchange had drawn attention from nearby pilots, and suddenly Maggie found herself the center of uncomfortable scrutiny. She could feel their eyes measuring her, questioning her capabilities, wondering if her reflexes were still sharp enough, if her vision was still keen enough, if her decision-making was still sound enough for the demands of competitive flying. Tommy Rodriguez, a cocky pilot in his early 30s who flew aerobatic demonstrations at airshows, sauntered over with his trademark swagger. 20,000 hours, huh? That's impressive. For the old days. But this competition isn't about experience. It's about precision, quick reactions, and the ability to handle stress. When's the last time you actually pushed an airplane to its limits? Maggie's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Last Tuesday," she replied simply. "I was practicing for today." The response caught Tommy off guard, and he recovered with a condescending chuckle. "Well, I hope you've got your affairs in order, because this competition is going to separate the wheat from the chaff. No offense, but maybe you should consider stepping aside before you embarrass yourself." What Tommy and the others didn't know was that Maggie had been preparing for this competition for months. While they assumed she was just another aging pilot, clinging to past glory, she'd been methodically honing her skills with the dedication of an Olympic athlete. Early morning flights in challenging weather conditions, precision pattern work until she could hit her landing marks within inches, navigation exercises that pushed her mental calculations to their limits, and emergency procedures practiced, until they were pure muscle memory. Dr. Patricia Williams, a flight surgeon who also competed in aerobatic competitions, approached the group with a more professional demeanor. "Mrs. Harrison, I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but have you considered the physical demands of this competition? The G-forces, the spatial disorientation, the stress on the cardiovascular system? At our age, we have to be realistic about our limitations." Maggie smiled warmly at the younger woman. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I passed my medical exam last month with flying colors. My physician was actually impressed with my physical condition. You know, people often forget that flying isn't just about physical strength, it's about mental acuity, decision-making under pressure, and the kind of situational awareness that comes from decades of experience." As the morning progressed, the weather briefing revealed challenging conditions that would test every pilot's skills. Wind gusts up to 25 knots, scattered clouds that would affect visibility during the navigation portion, and the potential for afternoon thunderstorms that could impact the final events. Several of the younger pilots began expressing concerns about the conditions, wondering if the competition should be postponed. But Maggie listened to the briefing with the calm demeanor of someone who'd flown through every type of weather condition imaginable. She'd navigated through mountain passes and turbulence that would terrify most pilots, landed on remote strips in crosswinds that pushed aircraft to their limits, and dealt with emergency situations that had tested every skill she'd ever learned. The practice period began with each pilot given 30 minutes to familiarize themselves with the competition course and practice their approach to the precision landing target. As aircraft took off and began their practice runs, the pattern became busy with pilots jockeying for position and trying to get a feel for the wind conditions. When Maggie's turn came, she climbed into her Cessna 182 with the practiced ease of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. The aircraft, while not as technologically advanced as some of the newer models in the competition, was perfectly maintained and equipped with everything she needed. More importantly, it was an extension of herself. Every gauge, every control, every sound and vibration as familiar as her own heartbeat. As she taxied for takeoff, she could see other pilots watching from the flight line, some with genuine curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. The radio crackled with the usual mixture of official communications and casual banter between pilots. But Maggie tuned it out, focusing instead on the task ahead. The takeoff was smooth and professional, executed with the kind of precision that commies from decades of practice. As she climbed to pattern altitude and began her practice approaches, something remarkable happened. The casual chatter on the radio began to quiet, and the pilots on the ground started paying closer attention to the silver-haired woman in the vintage Cessna. Her approaches were textbook perfect, stable, consistent, and executed with a level of precision that made the difficult look effortless. Each landing was within feet of the target. Her aircraft control was sublime, and her radio communications were crisp and professional. By the time she completed her practice session, the atmosphere on the ground had subtly shifted. The official competition began with the precision landing event, widely considered the most fundamental test of pilot skill. The concept was deceptively simple. Land your aircraft within a marked target area on the runway, with points deducted for every foot beyond the designated zone. What made it challenging was the wind, which had been gusting unpredictably all morning, and the psychological pressure of performing under the scrutiny of judges, fellow competitors, and a growing crowd of spectators. Competition order had been determined by random draw, and Maggie found herself scheduled to fly 13th out of the 48 participants. This placement gave her the advantage of watching several other pilots attempt the challenge, allowing her to study the wind patterns and observe the approaches that worked and those that didn't. The first pilot, a young flight instructor named Mark Peterson, approached the landing zone with confidence, but struggled with the crosswind component. His aircraft touched down nearly 15 feet long of the target, earning him a respectable but not exceptional score. The second pilot, attempting to compensate for the observed wind pattern, overcompensated and landed short, incurring even more significant penalties. As each pilot took their turn, a pattern began to emerge. The younger pilots, despite their confidence and modern equipment, were struggling with the variable wind conditions. Many were flying modern aircraft with sophisticated autopilot systems and advanced avionics, but the precision landing had to be flown manually, requiring the kind of stick and rudder skills that came from years of hands-on flying experience. Tommy Rodriguez, the cocky aerobatic pilot who'd questioned Maggie's abilities earlier, was scheduled to fly 11th. His approach started well, with a stable descent and good speed control. But as he crossed the threshold, a sudden wind gust caught him off guard. His aircraft ballooned slightly, and despite his efforts to recover, he touched down nearly 20 feet beyond the target zone. "Damn wind," Tommy muttered over the radio, his frustration evident. "This is more like gambling than flying." Dr. Patricia Williams, flying 10th, fared better with her methodical approach and careful attention to the wind indicators, but even she struggled with the gusting conditions, landing just outside the target zone despite her best efforts. Her scientific approach to the problem was sound, but she lacked the intuitive feel for wind and aircraft behavior that comes from decades of flying in challenging conditions. As Maggie's turn approached, she conducted her final pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision she'd used for 50 years. The younger pilots watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as she went through her routine, noting that she spent considerably more time studying the wind indicators and observing the movement of flags and windsocks around the airport. "Look at her," whispered Jake Morrison to his group of airline pilot friends. "She's taking forever just to figure out which way the wind is blowing. We've got sophisticated weather equipment that tells us everything we need to know." But Maggie was doing something that modern pilots often overlooked in their reliance on technology. She was reading the environment itself, watching the way dust moved across the runway, observing how the flags responded to wind shifts, noting the patterns of wind-driven clouds overhead. This was the kind of environmental awareness that had kept her safe through decades of flying, and it was about to prove its worth in competition. When her turn came, Maggie contacted the tower with her characteristically professional radio technique. "Tower, Cessna 739 Delta Mike, ready for the precision landing event." "Cessna 739 Delta Mike, runway 27, wind 250 at 18 gusting 25, cleared for takeoff." As she advanced the throttles and began her takeoff roll, Maggie felt the familiar thrill of acceleration that never got old, no matter how many times she'd experienced it. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, and she established a precise pattern altitude of 1,000 feet above ground level. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as a masterclass in aircraft control. Maggie's approach was unlike anything the other pilots had attempted. Instead of fighting the wind, she seemed to dance with it, making subtle adjustments to her crab angle and approach, speed that demonstrated an intimate understanding of how her aircraft behaved in these conditions. Her descent was stable but not rigid, allowing the aircraft to respond naturally to the wind variations while maintaining precise control over her flight path. As she approached the runway threshold, she made a series of small corrections that appeared effortless but were actually the result of decades of experience reading wind patterns and aircraft behavior. The touchdown was perfection. The main wheels contacted the runway precisely within the center of the target zone, with no float, no bounce, and no sideways drift. It was the kind of landing that made experienced pilots nod in recognition of superior skill and made student pilots wonder if they'd ever achieve such precision. The judge's announcement crackled over the radio. Cessna 739 Delta Mike. Distance from target, 2 feet, 6 inches. Current leader. A stunned silence fell over the flight line. The older woman who'd been dismissed as a relic from aviation's past had just executed the most precise landing of the day, outperforming pilots half her age who'd been supremely confident in their abilities. As Maggie taxied back to the parking area, she could see the other pilots gathered around the scoreboard, their expressions ranging from surprise to disbelief to grudging respect. But this was just the beginning. The precision landing event was only the first of 3 challenges, and the most difficult tests were yet to come. Tommy Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. "Maybe I underestimated her," he admitted to his friends. "That was some serious flying." Dr. Williams approached Maggie as she shut down her engine. "That was beautiful flying, Mrs. Harrison. I have to admit, I'm impressed." But Maggie just smiled and began preparing for the next phase of the competition. She knew that one good landing didn't win a competition, and she could sense that the other pilots were already adjusting their strategies, taking her more seriously as a competitor. The real test was just beginning. The second phase of the competition would test navigation, accuracy, and timing precision skills that separated professional pilots from weekend flyers. As the competitors gathered for the briefing, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The casual confidence that had characterized the morning was giving way to focused concentration, and all eyes seemed to drift toward Maggie, who sat quietly reviewing her charts while maintaining the same calm demeanor she'd shown all day. Her perfect precision landing had sent ripples through the competition field. Pilots who had initially dismissed her as a novelty were now studying her techniques, trying to understand how she had achieved such remarkable accuracy. The scoreboard showed her in the lead by a significant margin, and everyone knew that the navigation challenge would be crucial in determining who would ultimately claim victory. As the briefing for the navigation challenge began, the complexity of the task became apparent. Pilots would receive their course information just 30 minutes before departure, requiring them to quickly plot their route, calculate fuel requirements, determine checkpoint timing, and account for the still challenging wind conditions that had been plaguing the competition all day. "This isn't just about following a GPS," explained Chief Judge Captain Robert Bob Mitchell, a retired airline pilot with over 30,000 hours of flight time. "We'll be checking your arrival times at each checkpoint, your altitude accuracy, and your ability to fly precise headings. Modern avionics can help, but ultimately, this comes down to fundamental navigation skills and the ability to adapt when technology fails." The younger pilots immediately began spreading out their iPads and electronic flight bags, loading waypoints into their GPS systems, and calculating ground speeds using their sophisticated flight planning software. The technology was impressive real-time. Weather updates, automatic wind corrections, and navigation systems that could guide them to within meters of their intended course. But Maggie approached the challenge differently. She pulled out a well-worn paper sectional chart and began plotting her course with a pencil, ruler, and protractor tools that had served her well for decades. Her method appeared antiquated compared to the electronic displays surrounding her, but it was based on fundamental principles that didn't rely on satellites or batteries. "Seriously?" Jake Morrison laughed as he watched Maggie work. "You're going to navigate with paper charts? My GPS can give me turn directions and automatically adjust for wind. Why would anyone choose to do this the hard way?" Maggie looked up from her charts with a patient smile. Because, young man, I've seen GPS systems fail, iPad batteries die, and electronic displays go blank at the worst possible moments. This old-fashioned way has never failed me yet. Her comment drew skeptical looks from several pilots, but Dr. Williams, who had been quietly observing the exchange, nodded thoughtfully. "There's wisdom in understanding the fundamentals," she said. "Medical school taught me that you can't rely solely on technology. You need to understand the underlying principles." As the departure time approached, the weather briefing revealed additional challenges. The wind had shifted significantly since the morning, now coming from the southwest at 20 knots with gusts to 30. More concerning were the scattered clouds that had developed along the route, creating areas of reduced visibility and potential turbulence. Several pilots began expressing concerns about the conditions, wondering if the navigation challenge should be postponed. But the judges were adamant real-world flying meant dealing with real-world conditions, and a truly skilled pilot should be able to adapt to changing circumstances. Maggie was scheduled to depart fifth in the sequence, giving her the opportunity to observe how the first few pilots handled the initial checkpoint. What she saw was troubling. The first pilot, relying heavily on his GPS system, had difficulty maintaining his assigned altitude when he encountered unexpected turbulence. The second pilot, a young woman with impressive credentials from a major aviation university, struggled with wind drift calculations and arrived at her first checkpoint nearly 2 minutes late. When Maggie's turn came, she approached the challenge with the calm confidence of someone who had navigated through every type of weather and terrain imaginable. Her pre-flight planning had been meticulous, but unlike the other pilots who had spent most of their time programming GPS systems, she had focused on understanding the weather patterns and how they would affect her route. Tower, Cessna 739 Delta. Mike, ready for navigation challenge departure. Cessna 739 Delta Mike, runway 27. Wind 220 at 22 gusting 30. Cleared for takeoff. As she climbed away from the airport, Maggie made her first critical decision. Instead of following the direct route that most pilots were attempting, she chose a slightly longer path that would keep her in more favorable winds and avoid the worst of the turbulence that was developing along the original course. The first checkpoint was a small lake nestled in a valley 45 miles to the southeast. As she flew toward it, she could see other aircraft struggling with the wind conditions, some being pushed significantly off course by the strong crosswinds. But Maggie's aircraft seemed to track a steady course, arriving at the checkpoint precisely on time and at the exact altitude specified in the competition rules. Checkpoint Alpha, Cessna 739 Delta Mike. On time and on altitude, she reported to the judges monitoring the frequency. Cessna 739 Delta Mike, confirmed. Excellent work. The second checkpoint proved even more challenging. Located on a mountain ridge 65 miles further south, it required pilots to navigate through a complex series of valleys while maintaining precise timing and altitude. The winds were more turbulent here, and several pilots had already reported difficulties with their navigation systems due to GPS signal interference from the mountainous terrain. But this was exactly the type of flying that had defined Maggie's career. She had spent decades flying in remote areas where GPS was unreliable and weather was unpredictable. Her method of navigation, based on traditional pilotage and dead reckoning, was perfectly suited to these conditions. As she approached the mountain checkpoint, she could see another aircraft ahead of her, Tommy Rodriguez, in his sleek aerobatic plane struggling with the wind conditions. His aircraft was being pushed around by the turbulence, and it was clear he was having difficulty maintaining his assigned altitude and heading. Maggie's approach was different. Instead of fighting the turbulence, she worked with it, using her understanding of mountain flying to find the smoother air and maintain better control of her aircraft. Her arrival at the checkpoint was precisely on time, and her altitude was exactly as specified. Checkpoint Bravo, Cessna 739 Delta Mike, on time and on altitude. Cessna 739 Delta Mike, confirmed. Outstanding navigation work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The third and final checkpoint was the most challenging yet. Located at a remote airstrip 55 miles to the west, it required pilots to navigate through an area of scattered clouds and reduced visibility, while maintaining precise timing for their arrival. Several pilots had already reported difficulties with this segment, and one had even elected to return to the starting airport rather than risk flying in the deteriorating conditions. But Maggie pressed on, using her decades of experience flying in marginal weather conditions to navigate safely through the challenging terrain. Her arrival at the final checkpoint was once again precisely on time and at the exact altitude specified. As she began her return flight to the competition airport, Maggie reflected on the navigation challenge. She had executed it flawlessly, but she knew the most demanding test was still ahead. The aerial skills challenge would push every pilot to their absolute limits, requiring not just technical proficiency, but the kind of precision and composure that came from decades of experience. Under pressure. When she touched down at Riverside Municipal Airport, she could see the crowd of spectators had grown significantly. Word of the remarkable competition was spreading, and pilots from neighboring airports were arriving to witness what many were already calling the most surprising upset in competitive flying history. But Maggie knew that surprises only lasted as long as people underestimated you, and after two dominant performances, no one was underestimating her anymore. The final phase of the competition was the Aerial Skills Challenge, a demanding sequence of maneuvers that would test every aspect of pilot proficiency. Unlike the precision landing and navigation challenges, which relied heavily on planning and steady execution, the aerial skills phase required split-second decision-making, precise aircraft control, and the ability to perform under intense pressure. Course was designed to simulate emergency scenarios that pilots might encounter in real-world flying situations. It included simulated engine failures, unusual attitude recoveries, precision climbs and descents, and a series of ground reference maneuvers that required pilots to maintain exact altitudes and airspeeds while flying specific patterns over the ground. By the time the Aerial Skills Challenge began, word had spread throughout the aviation community about the remarkable performance of the 73-year-old pilot who was currently leading the competition. The crowd of spectators had grown significantly, with pilots from neighboring airports arriving to witness what many were calling the most surprising competition in recent memory. The judges had set up a comprehensive scoring system that evaluated each maneuver based on altitude accuracy, heading, precision, airspeed control, and smoothness of execution. Points were deducted for any deviation from the specified parameters, and safety was paramount. Any maneuver that compromised flight safety would result in immediate disqualification. Maggie was scheduled to fly 7th in the aerial skills sequence, which meant she would have the opportunity to observe how several other pilots handled the challenging maneuvers. What she saw was both encouraging and concerning. The pilots were skilled, but many were struggling with the psychological pressure of performing complex maneuvers under scrutiny. The first maneuver was a simulated engine failure at 3,000 feet, requiring pilots to immediately establish best glide speed, select an appropriate landing site, and execute a power-off approach to a designated area on the airport. The pilot would then be required to execute a go-around at 500 feet, simulating the restoration of engine power. Tommy Rodriguez, flying 4th in the sequence, started the maneuver well but made a critical error in his site selection, choosing a landing area that was too close to obstacles. His go-around was executed properly, but the judges noted the poor judgment in his initial decision-making. Dr. Williams, flying 5th, demonstrated excellent technique in her emergency procedures, but her approach was too conservative, resulting in an approach that would have left her short of her intended landing area in a real emergency situation. Jake Morrison, flying sixth, had the opposite problem. His approach was too aggressive, resulting in an approach that would have put him beyond his intended landing area, with no options for adjustment. When Maggie's turn came, she approached the aerial skills challenge with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout the competition. But there was something different now, a sense of confidence and purpose that came from decades of dealing with real emergencies in real aircraft. The simulated engine failure began as she leveled off at 3,000 feet. The judge in the rear seat pulled the throttle to idle and announced, "Engine failure, this is not a drill." Maggie's response was immediate and perfect. She simultaneously pushed the nose down to establish best glide speed, began scanning for suitable landing sites, and started her emergency checklist. Her aircraft control was superb, maintaining exactly the optimal glide speed while she evaluated her options. Her choice of landing site was textbook perfect, a large open field with good approaches and no significant obstacles. Her radio communications were clear and professional, and her approach to the field was stable and well controlled. The go-around at 500 feet was executed with precision, demonstrating both her emergency procedures and her ability to transition back to normal flight operations. The second maneuver was a series of unusual attitude recoveries designed to test a pilot's ability to recognize and recover from potentially dangerous flight attitudes. The pilot would be required to close their eyes while the judge maneuvered the aircraft into unusual attitudes, then recovered a normal flight when instructed. This maneuver had proven challenging for several pilots, with some taking too long to recognize the aircraft's attitude and others using excessive control inputs that resulted in secondary unusual attitudes. The key was smooth, deliberate control inputs and a clear understanding of aerodynamic principles. When Maggie's turn came, her recoveries were textbook perfect. Each unusual attitude was recognized immediately, and her control inputs were smooth and appropriate. There was no wasted motion, no excessive control deflections, and no secondary unusual attitudes. It was the kind of flying that demonstrated not just skill, but an intimate understanding of aircraft behavior and aerodynamics. The third maneuver was a precision climb and descent, requiring pilots to climb from 2,000 feet to 4,000 feet at exactly 500 feet per minute, then descend back to 2,000 feet at exactly 500 feet per minute, all while maintaining a precise heading and airspeed. This maneuver had proven particularly challenging because it required pilots to constantly adjust their power settings and pitch attitudes to maintain the exact performance parameters. Many pilots had struggled with the coordination required, either maintaining proper climb rate at the expense of airspeed, or maintaining airspeed at the expense of climb rate. Maggie's execution was flawless. Her climb began at exactly 500 feet per minute and remained there throughout the entire 2,000-foot climb. Her airspeed varied by no more than 2 knots from the specified value, and her heading remained rock steady. The descent was equally precise, with her rate of descent and airspeed control demonstrating the kind of precision that comes from decades of experience. The final maneuver was a series of ground reference maneuvers, including S-turns across a road, turns around a point, and rectangular patterns. These maneuvers required pilots to maintain constant altitude while adjusting their bank angles and ground track to account for wind drift. Ground reference maneuvers were fundamental skills that every pilot learned early in their training, but performing them with competition-level precision under pressure was a different challenge entirely. The judges were looking for perfectly symmetrical patterns, constant altitude, and proper wind drift correction. As Maggie began her ground reference maneuvers, it became clear that she was operating at a different level than the other competitors. Her S-turns were perfectly symmetrical. Her turns around a point were perfectly circular, and her rectangular patterns had sharp, precise corners. It was the kind of flying that made it look easy, but every pilot watching knew the skill required. To execute such precise maneuvers. As the Aerial Skills Challenge concluded, the tension at Riverside Municipal Airport was palpable. Pilots, judges, and spectators gathered around the Flight Operations Building, where the final scores were being tabulated. The competition had been the most closely contested in the event's 15-year history, with several pilots performing at exceptionally high levels. But everyone knew that one performance had stood out above all others. The 73-year-old pilot, who had been dismissed as a relic from aviation's past, had not only competed with pilots half her age, she had outperformed them in every phase of the competition. The scoring system was complex, with points awarded for each element of the three main challenges: precision landing, navigation accuracy, and aerial skills. Penalties were assessed for any deviations from the specified parameters, and bonus points were available for exceptional performance in challenging conditions. As the judges compiled their final calculations, conversations throughout the crowd centered on the remarkable performance they had witnessed. Pilots who had initially questioned Maggie's abilities were now discussing her techniques, trying to understand how she had achieved such consistently superior results. "I've been flying professionally for 12 years, said Captain Lisa Martinez, who flew for a major airline and had finished in the top 10. "I've never seen flying like that. Her precision was incredible, but more than that, she made everything look effortless. That's the mark of a true professional." Tommy Rodriguez, who had been among the most skeptical of Maggie's abilities, was now singing a different tune. "I owe her an apology," he admitted to his friends. "I was so focused on her age that I completely missed her skill level. That was some of the best flying I've ever seen." Dr. Williams, who had finished respectably in the middle of the pack, was equally impressed. "What struck me most was her decision-making," she observed. "Every choice she made was optimal. Her route selection, her approach techniques, her maneuver execution, everything was perfectly calculated and flawlessly executed." Jake Morrison, the airline pilot who had been particularly dismissive of Maggie's capabilities, was having a moment of serious self-reflection. "I realize now that I was making assumptions based on stereotypes rather than facts," he said. "Her logbook should have told me everything I needed to know about her abilities. 20,000 hours of experience is 20,000 hours of learning." And it showed in every aspect of her flying. As the wait for results continued, Maggie remained characteristically calm and composed. She had given her best effort in every phase of the competition, and she knew that she had flown to the limits of her abilities. Whether that would be enough to win was now out of her hands. The other pilots began approaching her with questions about her techniques, her career, and her approach to flying. What they discovered was a pilot who had dedicated her entire adult life to aviation, constantly learning, constantly improving, and never allowing herself to become complacent. "The key to good flying," Maggie explained to a group of younger pilots, "isn't just technical skill, though that's certainly important. It's about decision-making, situational awareness, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. Those skills develop over time, through experience, through making mistakes, and learning from them." She paused, looking at the eager faces around her. "When I started flying, I thought I knew everything after I got my license. Then I thought I knew everything after I got my instrument rating, then my commercial license. But the truth is, every flight teaches you something new if you're paying attention. After 50 years and 20,000 hours, I'm still learning." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Judge Bob Mitchell, carrying a clipboard with the final results. The crowd gathered around as he prepared to announce the winners of each category and the overall champion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the now quiet flight line, This has been one of the most competitive and impressive flying competitions I've had the privilege to judge. The level of skill demonstrated today was exceptional, and the challenging conditions made every pilot work for their scores." He paused, looking down at his clipboard. "Before I announce the winners, I want to say that every pilot who competed today should be proud of their performance. Flying at this level of precision under pressure is no easy task, and each of you demonstrated the kind of skill that makes general aviation the vibrant community it is." The tension was almost unbearable as he continued. In third place with a total score of 847 points, Captain Lisa Martinez. Applause rippled through the crowd as Lisa stepped forward to accept her trophy. In second place, with a total score of 863 points, Dr. Patricia Williams. More applause followed as Dr. Williams accepted her award with a gracious smile. "And now," Judge Mitchell said, his voice rising slightly, "the overall champion of this year's annual Precision Flying Championship, with a total score of 931 points, a new competition record, Mrs. Margaret Harrison." The crowd erupted in applause that was both thunderous and heartfelt. Pilots who had initially questioned Maggie's abilities were now cheering the loudest, recognizing that they had witnessed something truly special. As Maggie walked forward to accept her trophy, she was struck by the irony of the moment. She had spent her entire flying career fighting assumptions about what she couldn't do because of her gender, and now she was fighting assumptions about what she couldn't do because of her age. But here, in the place where only performance mattered, she had proved that skill, experience, and dedication could triumph over prejudice and preconceptions. "Mrs. Harrison," Judge Mitchell said as he handed her the trophy, "that was some of the finest flying I've seen in my 40 years in aviation. You've set a new standard for this competition." Maggie accepted the trophy with characteristic grace and humility. "Thank you," she said simply. "This sport has given me everything: adventure, challenge, purpose, and friendships that have lasted a lifetime. I'm honored to compete alongside such skilled pilots, regardless of their age." As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, pilots continued to approach Maggie with congratulations and questions. Many wanted to know her secrets, her techniques, her approach to maintaining such high levels of proficiency well into her 70s. "There's no secret," she told them. "I fly regularly, I study constantly, and I never assume I know everything. The moment you stop learning in aviation is the moment you start becoming dangerous." Tommy Rodriguez approached her with a sheepish expression. "Mrs. Harrison, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your abilities based on your age, and I was completely wrong. That was some of the best flying I've ever seen." Maggie smiled warmly. "Tommy, I appreciate that, but there's no need to apologize. We all make assumptions sometimes. The important thing is that we learn from them and do better next time." As the sun began to set over Riverside Municipal Airport, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Maggie prepared for the flight home. She had no idea that this victory was just the beginning of something much larger, that her story would soon reach far beyond this small regional airport and inspire pilots around the world. The trophy was nice, but the real prize would be the conversations her victory would start, and the barriers it would break down for aviators everywhere. What Maggie didn't know as she flew home that evening was that her victory was about to become something much bigger than a regional flying competition. Even before she had touched down at her home airport, photos and videos from the day's events were already being shared across social media. Aviation forums were buzzing with discussions about the 73-year-old pilot who had shattered the competition record while outflying pilots half her age. The news of Maggie Harrison's victory spread through the aviation community like wildfire. Within hours of the competition's conclusion, social media was buzzing with photos, videos, and stories about her remarkable performance. Aviation forums exploded with discussions about experience versus youth, the value of traditional flying skills, and the dangerous assumptions that pervade the industry. But the story's reach extended far beyond the aviation world. Local news stations picked up the story, drawn by the compelling narrative of age triumphing over prejudice. The footage of Maggie's precision flying, captured by spectators' phones and official competition cameras, went viral across social media platforms. Suddenly, the silver-haired pilot in the vintage leather jacket became a symbol of something. Much larger than flying, she became a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told they were too old, too inexperienced, or too different to achieve their dreams. The response from the aviation community was overwhelmingly positive, but it also sparked important conversations about the assumptions and biases that existed within the industry. Flight. Schools began receiving inquiries from older students who had been inspired by Maggie's story. Airlines started re-examining their policies regarding age and experience. Flying clubs across the country reported increased interest from pilots who had been considering retirement but were now motivated to continue flying. Margaret Maggie Harrison had become more than just a competition winner. She had become a catalyst for change. 3 weeks after the competition, Maggie received a phone call that would change her life once again. The caller was Dr. Jennifer Chang, a researcher at the National Institute on Aging who had been following the story of her victory. "Mrs. Harrison," Dr. Chang began, "I hope you don't mind me calling, but your story has caught the attention of researchers across the country. We're conducting a study on cognitive performance and motor skills in older adults, and we'd love to include you in our research." Maggie listened with interest as Dr. Chang explained the study. Researchers were trying to understand how certain individuals maintain such high levels of performance well into their later years, particularly in demanding fields like aviation, surgery, and professional sports. The goal was to identify factors that contributed to sustained excellence and to develop programs that could help others maintain their abilities as they aged. "What we're finding," Dr. Chang continued, "is that individuals like yourself, who continue to challenge themselves intellectually and physically, often perform at levels that exceed much younger people. Your competition performance is a perfect example of this phenomenon." The conversation led to Maggie's involvement in a comprehensive study that would examine everything from her reaction times and decision-making processes to her physical fitness and cognitive abilities. The results would later contribute to groundbreaking research on successful aging and the factors that allow some individuals to maintain peak performance throughout their lives. But perhaps more importantly, the study would provide scientific backing for what Maggie had always believed, that age was less important than attitude, experience was more valuable than youth, and continuous learning was the key to maintaining excellence in any field. Meanwhile, the impact of Maggie's victory continued to ripple through the aviation community. Flight instructor Tom Bradley, who had been teaching for over 30 years, found himself approaching his older students with new respect and attention. "Maggie's story reminded me that experience has value," he explained to his colleagues. "I was so focused on teaching the latest techniques and technologies that I sometimes forgot to appreciate the wisdom that comes with years of flying." Airlines began to take notice as well. Captain Sarah Mitchell, chief pilot for a major regional airline, initiated a program to pair experienced pilots nearing retirement with younger pilots just starting their careers. "We realized we were losing decades of knowledge and experience every time a senior pilot retired," she explained. Maggie's victory reminded us that experience is an asset, not a liability. The program, dubbed Wisdom Wings, became a model for other airlines and was eventually adopted by aviation organizations worldwide. It recognized that the combination of youthful energy and experienced wisdom created the strongest possible flight crews. Flying schools also felt the impact of Maggie's story. Sunrise Aviation Academy, where Maggie had earned several of her ratings decades earlier, reported a 40% increase in enrollment from students over age 50. The school's owner, Patricia Webb, attributed the surge directly to Maggie's victory. Her story gave people permission to pursue their dreams, regardless of their age, Webb explained. We've had students in their 60s earning their private pilot licenses, students in their 70s pursuing instrument ratings, and even a few in their 80s working on advanced certifications. Maggie showed them that it's never too late to reach for the sky. The story also reached beyond aviation to inspire people in other fields. Margaret Chun, a 68-year-old retired teacher, was so inspired by Maggie's story that she decided to pursue her lifelong dream of becoming a professional photographer. If Maggie could compete with pilots half her age and win, then I could certainly learn to use a camera professionally, she said. David Rodriguez, a 72-year-old retired engineer, was motivated to return to competitive cycling after seeing Maggie's victory. Her story reminded me that experience and determination can overcome assumptions about age, he said. I may not be as fast as I was at 30, but I have wisdom and endurance that I didn't have then. The ripple effects extended to academic research as well. Universities began studying the phenomenon of expert aging, examining how individuals in various fields maintained high levels of performance well into their later years. Maggie's story became a case study in programs ranging from gerontology to sports psychology. Dr. Michael Thompson, a professor of psychology at Stanford University, incorporated Maggie's story into his research on stereotype threat and performance. Her victory is a perfect example of how individuals can overcome negative stereotypes through superior preparation and performance, he explained. It shows that when we remove our preconceptions and focus on actual ability, we often discover that our assumptions were completely wrong. The story also reached international audiences. Aviation publications in Europe, Asia, and Australia featured Maggie's victory, sparking similar conversations about age and ability in flying communities worldwide. The Royal Aeronautical Society in London invited her to speak at their annual conference, and the Japan Pilots Association requested her participation in a symposium on aging and aviation. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the next generation of pilots. Young aviators who had witnessed Maggie's performance began approaching flying with a new respect for experience and traditional skills. Flight schools reported that students were showing increased interest in learning traditional navigation techniques, understanding fundamental aerodynamics, and developing the kind of stick and rudder skills that had served Maggie so well. Maggie's victory was a wake-up call for all of us, explained Captain Jennifer Adams, a 28-year-old airline pilot. We realized that we had become too dependent on technology and had lost touch with the fundamental skills that make great pilots. Her performance reminded us that there's no substitute for experience, wisdom, and a deep understanding of how aircraft actually fly. In the months following her competition victory, Maggie found herself thrust into a role she had never expected, that of mentor and inspiration to pilots across the country. Her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and mentorship opportunities. Aviation magazines wanted her story, flying clubs wanted her wisdom, and flight schools wanted her expertise. Initially, Maggie was hesitant about the attention. She had always been a private person, preferring the solitude of flight to the spotlight of public recognition. But as she began to understand the impact her story was having on other pilots, particularly older aviators who had been considering retirement, she realized she had a responsibility to share her experience and knowledge. Her first major speaking engagement was at the annual convention of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, AOPA, where she addressed an audience of over 3,000 pilots. The title of her presentation was Experience, Aviation's Most Valuable Asset. and it would become one of the most watched aviation presentations in history. When I started flying 50 years ago, Maggie began, looking out at the sea of faces, I was told that aviation was a young person's game. I was told that as I got older, my reflexes would slow, my decision-making would deteriorate, and my abilities would decline. I was told that I should plan for retirement from flying before I became a danger to myself and others. She paused, letting her words sink in. But here's what I've learned after 5 decades and 20,000 hours of flying. Aviation isn't about age, it's about proficiency. It's not about how fast your reflexes are, it's about how good your decisions are. It's not about how strong you are, it's about how smart you fly. The audience was captivated as she continued. The competition I won wasn't about youth versus age. It was about preparation versus assumption, experience versus arrogance, and wisdom versus ignorance. The younger pilots I competed against were skilled, talented, and dedicated. But they made the mistake of underestimating what experience and continuous learning could achieve. Her presentation went on to outline the principles that had guided her flying career, the importance of continuous learning, the value of traditional skills in an era of advanced technology, and the need for pilots to challenge themselves constantly, rather than becoming complacent. The moment you stop learning in aviation, she concluded, is the moment you start becoming dangerous. Age doesn't make you unsafe, complacency does. Declining skills don't make you a hazard refusing to address. Those declining skills does. The presentation received a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. But more importantly, it sparked a movement within the aviation community to recognize and value the contributions of experienced pilots while also challenging them to maintain the highest standards of proficiency. Following the AOPA presentation, Maggie began receiving invitations to speak at flying clubs, flight schools, and aviation organizations across the country. Each presentation was tailored to the specific audience, but the core message remained the same. Experience was valuable, age was just a number, and continuous learning was the key to maintaining excellence. At the Women in Aviation Conference, she spoke about breaking barriers and challenging stereotypes. I've spent my entire flying career being told what I couldn't do, she told the audience of female pilots. First because I was a woman, then because I was old. But the sky doesn't care about your gender or your age, it only cares about your skill and your judgment. At the Experimental Aircraft Association, AA convention, she focused on the value of traditional flying skills. These beautiful modern aircraft with their sophisticated avionics are wonderful tools, she explained, but they're still just tools. The most important components of any aircraft are the pilot's brain, experience, and judgment. Technology can enhance these qualities, but it can never replace them. At flight instructor conferences, she emphasized the importance of recognizing and nurturing talent, regardless of age. Some of the best pilots I've ever known didn't start flying until their 50s or 60s, she told the instructors. They brought life experience, maturity, and a deep appreciation for the privilege of flight that younger students sometimes lack. But perhaps Maggie's most important work was the individual mentoring she began providing to pilots across the country. She established a program called Sage Wings, which paired experienced pilots with younger aviators for ongoing mentorship and knowledge transfer. The program worked both ways. Experienced pilots shared their wisdom and knowledge while learning about new technologies and techniques from their younger counterparts. It created a bridge between generations of pilots and helped ensure that valuable experience and knowledge weren't lost when senior pilots retired. One of Maggie's first mentees was Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old commercial pilot who had been struggling with confidence issues in challenging weather conditions. I had all the technical knowledge, Jennifer explained, but I lacked the practical experience to make good decisions under pressure. Maggie taught me that good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from surviving bad judgment, but only if you learn from it. Under Maggie's guidance, Jennifer began approaching challenging flights with a new mindset. Instead of relying solely on her instruments and autopilot, she learned to read the weather, understand the aircraft's behavior, and make decisions based on the totality of the situation rather than just the technical parameters. Maggie taught me that flying is both an art and a science, Jennifer said. The science gives you the technical knowledge, but the art gives you the judgment to apply that knowledge effectively. That's something you can only learn from someone who has been there and done that. Another mentee was Robert Kim, a 35-year-old flight instructor who had been teaching for 5 years, but felt like he was just going through the motions. "I was teaching students to pass their check rides," he admitted, "but I wasn't teaching them to be good pilots." Maggie showed me the difference. Under Maggie's influence, Robert began incorporating more real-world scenarios into his training, emphasizing decision-making and judgment alongside technical skills. His students began performing better, not just on their check rides, but in their subsequent flying careers. The Sage Wings program grew rapidly, with experienced pilots and younger aviators from across the country requesting participation. It became a model for other industries, showing how knowledge and experience could be transferred effectively between generations. But for Maggie, the most rewarding aspect of her mentoring work was seeing the transformation in the pilots she worked with. "There's nothing more satisfying than watching a young pilot develop the confidence and judgment that comes from understanding, not just memorizing," she explained. "When they start making good decisions instinctively, when they start reading the whole situation instead of just the instruments, when they start flying with their hearts as well as their heads, that's when you know you've made a difference." As her influence grew and her story reached international audiences, Maggie realized that her competition victory had been just the beginning. The real victory would be measured not in trophies or records, but in the number of pilots inspired to continue flying, the barriers broken down for older aviators, and the shift in perspective about what was possible when experience met opportunity. 2 years after her competition victory, Maggie Harrison's influence on aviation had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined. Her story had become a touchstone for discussions about age, experience, and excellence in flying. Universities studied her performance, airlines modified their training programs based on her techniques, and flight schools incorporated her principles into their curricula. But perhaps the most significant impact of Maggie's story was the cultural shift it had created within the aviation community. The casual ageism that had once been commonplace in pilot lounges and flight training facilities had largely disappeared, replaced by a new respect for experience and wisdom. Pilots were no longer automatically assumed to be declining in ability simply because of their age, and older aviators were no longer pressured to retire prematurely. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, took notice of this cultural shift and commissioned a comprehensive study on aging and aviation performance. The study, led by Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a flight surgeon and researcher at the FAA Civil Aerospace Medical Institute, examined the relationship between age and pilot performance across thousands of aviators. "What we found challenged many of our assumptions about aging and flying," Dr. Rodriguez explained in her final report. "While certain physical abilities may decline with age, other factors experience judgment, situational awareness, and decision-making skills often improve. The key is not chronological age, but rather maintained proficiency and continued learning." The study's findings led to significant changes in how the FAA approached medical certification for older pilots. Instead of focusing solely on physical parameters, the agency began considering the whole pilot, their experience, their training recency, their commitment to maintaining proficiency, and their overall approach to aviation safety. These changes had profound implications for the aviation industry. Airlines began retaining experienced pilots longer, recognizing that their knowledge and judgment were valuable assets that couldn't be easily replaced. Flight schools started recruiting older students more actively, understanding that mature students often brought unique advantages to their training. The insurance industry also took notice. Aviation insurance companies, which had traditionally charged higher premiums for older pilots, began offering discounts for pilots who demonstrated continued proficiency through regular training and testing. Maggie's story had shown that age alone was not a predictor of risk. Skill and judgment were far more important factors. The international aviation community was equally impacted by Maggie's story. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, invited her to speak at their annual assembly, where she addressed delegates from 193 countries about the value of experience in aviation safety. "Safety in aviation doesn't come from youth," she told the assembly. "It comes from knowledge, experience, and good judgment. These qualities don't decline with age, they improve with experience, provided that pilots remain committed to continuous learning and improvement." Her presentation led to changes in international aviation policies, with many countries revising their approaches to pilot medical certification and training requirements. The European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, incorporated her principles into their training standards, emphasizing the importance of experience and judgment alongside technical proficiency. But beyond the policy changes and regulatory modifications, Maggie's most lasting impact was on individual pilots and their approach to flying. Hundreds of pilots credited her story with changing their perspective on aging in aviation, inspiring them to continue flying well into their later years. Captain Michael Thompson, who had been considering early retirement at age 60, decided to continue flying after seeing Maggie's performance. "Her story reminded me that I had too much to offer to just walk away," he said. "I realized that my experience was valuable, not just to me, but to the younger pilots I flew with and the students I taught." Thompson went on to become one of the most respected training captains at his airline, known for his ability to impart not just technical knowledge, but also the kind of practical wisdom that comes from decades of experience. He retired at 65, not because he was forced to, but because he was ready to pursue other interests while his abilities were still at their peak. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had competed against Maggie in the original competition, was inspired to start a program for women pilots over 50. "Maggie's story showed us that our best flying years don't have to be behind us," she explained. "Experience combined with maintained proficiency can lead to our best performance at any age." The program, called Silver Wings, became a model for other organizations, providing both flying opportunities and mentorship for mature women pilots. It addressed the unique challenges faced by women in aviation, while celebrating the valuable contributions they made to the field. Tommy Rodriguez, who had been among the most skeptical of Maggie's abilities before the competition, became one of her strongest advocates. He incorporated her principles into his aerobatic instruction, emphasizing the importance of experience and judgment alongside technical skill. "Maggie taught me that age and experience are assets, not liabilities," he said. "I was so focused on physical abilities that I forgot about the mental aspects of flying." Her victory reminded me that aviation is as much about thinking as it is about doing. The aviation industry also began recognizing the economic value of experienced pilots. Airlines discovered that older pilots often had lower insurance claims, fewer violations, and better passenger safety records. Flight schools found that mature students were often more dedicated, more focused, and more likely to complete their training successfully. This recognition led to new programs specifically designed for older pilots. Major airlines began offering second career pilot programs for individuals who wanted to transition into aviation later in life. Flight schools developed accelerated training programs that recognized the life experience and maturity that older students brought to their studies. Equipment manufacturers also took notice. Avionics companies began designing systems that enhanced rather than replaced traditional flying skills, recognizing that the most effective cockpit designs combined modern technology with time-tested principles of aviation. The story of Maggie Harrison had become more than just an inspiring tale of individual achievement. It had become a catalyst for fundamental changes in how the aviation industry understood and valued experience, age, and wisdom. Her victory had proven that excellence in aviation wasn't about youth or physical strength, but about skill, judgment, and the continuous pursuit of improvement. As Maggie often said in her presentations, aviation doesn't care about your age, it only cares about your abilities. And abilities, unlike age, are something you can always improve. But even as the industry changed around her and her influence grew, Maggie remained focused on what mattered most to her: flying, learning, and sharing her passion for aviation with others. The years following her competition victory would see her evolution from champion pilot to beloved mentor, as she discovered that her greatest contribution to aviation wasn't her flying skill. It was her ability to inspire others to reach beyond what they thought possible. Now, several years after that remarkable victory, 5 years after her competition victory, Maggie Harrison continued to fly regularly, though she had scaled back her competitive activities to focus on mentoring and education. At 78, she remained as sharp and skilled as ever, a living testament to the principles she had championed throughout her career. Her hangar at Riverside Municipal Airport had become something of a pilgrimage site for pilots from around the world. The walls were covered with photos from her flying career, certificates and awards spanning 5 decades, and letters from pilots whose lives had been changed by her story. The centerpiece was her trusty Cessna 182, still meticulously maintained and still capable of demonstrating the kind of precision flying that had made her famous. On a typical morning, Maggie could be found in the hangar, either working on her aircraft or meeting with one of her many mentees. The Sage Wings program had grown to include over 500 pilot pairs worldwide, creating a network of knowledge transfer that was revolutionizing how aviation experience was shared and preserved. "People often ask me when I'm going to retire," Maggie would tell visitors to her hangar. "But retire from what? From flying? From teaching? From learning? As long as I can pass my medical exams and maintain my proficiency, why would I stop doing what I love?" Her commitment to continuous learning remained as strong as ever. She had recently completed training in advanced avionics, learning to operate the latest glass cockpit systems with the same dedication she had shown throughout her career. She had also begun studying unmanned aircraft systems, recognizing that the future of aviation would likely include autonomous and remotely piloted aircraft. "The technology keeps evolving," she explained to a group of young pilots, "but the fundamental principles of flight remain the same. Understanding those principles is what allows you to adapt to any aircraft, any system, any situation." Her influence extended far beyond individual pilots. The aviation industry had embraced many of the principles she had championed, leading to significant improvements in safety, training, and pilot retention. Airlines reported that their most experienced pilots were staying active longer, bringing valuable knowledge and mentorship to younger colleagues. Flight schools had seen a dramatic increase in older students, with many reporting that mature students had become their most successful graduates. The combination of life experience, financial stability, and serious commitment to learning created ideal conditions for flight training success. The research community continued to study Maggie's performance and the principles she represented. Dr. Jennifer Chang's longitudinal study of expert aging had produced groundbreaking findings about how certain individuals maintained peak performance well into their later years. The study had implications far beyond aviation, influencing fields from medicine to athletics to business leadership. What we've learned from studying individuals like Maggie Dr. Chang explained, is that cognitive and physical performance don't automatically decline with age. In fact, in complex fields that require judgment and decision-making, performance often improves with experience. The key is maintaining what we call deliberate practice, continuous, focused improvement, rather than simple repetition. The study had identified several factors that contributed to sustained excellence: continuous learning, regular practice, physical fitness, mental stimulation, and social engagement. Maggie embodied all of these factors, serving as a model for successful aging in demanding professions. International recognition of Maggie's contributions continued to grow. She was inducted into the International Women in Aviation Hall of Fame, received the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award from the FAA, and was named an honorary fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. But perhaps the recognition she treasured most was the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Association of Flight Instructors, recognizing her contributions to aviation education and mentorship. "Teaching has always been about more than just imparting knowledge," she said in her acceptance speech. "It's about inspiring people to reach beyond what they think is possible, to challenge their assumptions, and to never stop learning. If my story has inspired even one pilot to continue flying, one student to pursue their dreams, or one instructor to see the potential in every student regardless of age, then I've accomplished what I set out to do." The aviation community had also established the Margaret Harrison Excellence in Aviation Award, recognizing pilots who demonstrated exceptional skill, judgment, and dedication to the advancement of aviation safety and education. The award was given annually to pilots who embodied the principles that Maggie had championed throughout her career. The first recipient was Captain Sarah Chun, a 45-year-old airline pilot who had started flying at age 35 after being inspired by Maggie's story. "I thought I was too old to become a professional pilot," Sarah said in her acceptance speech. "But Maggie's example showed me that it's never too late to pursue your dreams if you're willing to work for them." As Maggie approached her 80th birthday, she showed no signs of slowing down. She continued to fly regularly, teach actively, and inspire constantly. Her calendar was filled with speaking engagements, mentoring sessions, and flights with pilots who wanted to learn from her experience. "People sometimes ask me what I want my legacy to be," she reflected during a recent interview. "I want it to be simple, that I helped people understand that excellence in aviation or any field isn't about age, gender, or background. It's about dedication, continuous learning, and the willingness to challenge yourself constantly." Her story had become part of aviation lore, told in flight schools, pilot lounges, and aviation museums around the world. But more than just a story, it had become a principle, a reminder that the sky truly was the limit for anyone willing to work for their dreams. As she often said in her presentations, "The beautiful thing about aviation is that it's a meritocracy. The sky doesn't care about your age, your gender, or your background. It only cares about your skill, your judgment, and your respect for the principles of flight. Master those, and you can fly for as long as you want." The silver-haired pilot, who had once been mocked for being too old, had become a beacon of possibility, proving that with dedication, skill, and the right attitude, it was never too late to soar. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.